Hi, this is Jason from YBF Ventures, and I'm sitting down here today with Farley Blackman, the CEO of YBF Ventures, to talk about innovation in the new normal. Farley is a globally experienced executive across commercial and industrial businesses in multiple geographies with companies like BP and GE. He's also been an entrepreneur, founding companies in lifestyle, arts, and travel. He's got a wealth of experience, and he's been the CEO of YBF for the last 2.5 years. Farley, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks.
So obviously COVID-19 has turned the world upside down, both from a societal and economic perspective. I'll start with a broad question. What does the new normal look like?
It's a big question. The new normal is very personal, I think, more so than crises of the past, if you will. And it seems to be evolving and changing all the time. So what started as a health crisis has quickly and clearly become a financial crisis. And what we see happening in the US and elsewhere has become a crisis in society more generally. For companies, though, all those things matter and they all affect companies. But I would argue that companies need to be able to weather crises as part of their way of sustaining.
And when you say innovation, what does innovation mean to you, having been an innovator in multiple companies yourself?
Yeah, innovation to me is really all about not being comfortable. It's about continuously challenging the status quo. It's about tapping into a restlessness in order to do things differently, to do things better. And there should always be continuous improvement, and a lot of companies talk about continuous improvement. That could be considered innovative at some level, but really innovation comes through some step change actions, some step change of products, some step changes in services. So it's destroying the status quo to really create a new future.
Do you see the way that companies approach innovation changing from pre-COVID-19 to post-COVID-19?
Listen, I think some things are going to be quite obvious, as we move to a world that isn't solely office-based to a world that is partially office-based, partially home-based, partially remote, partially local. I think we find ourselves in probably the right balance we should have been all along. And it's innovation, it's this change, I should say, that has been forced upon us that is making us look at things a bit differently and finding the right balance. The end of the day, we have to work together, but we also need to be able to innovate apart. And I think it's those changes that are going to be quite different. There's been a work from home, I'll call it threat for years, and how do we have remote workforces? But there's really not been that burning platform, that need to change, and COVID-19 has given us that. But it's also at the same time shown us that we're not as efficient. We're not as effective when we're completely distributed. So how do we use technology to enable us to work remotely, to tap into talent wherever it may be, but at the same time come together? And it's that balance, it's that push and pull, it's that crisis-induced versus companies creating their own mini crises, certainly not at the level of COVID, but their own mini crises in order to create that urgency, that need, that restlessness to do things differently.
One of the core things of this new normal is, remote working. But do you see any other more pervasive changes across what companies need to do post-COVID-19 as well as part of this new normal?
Yeah, a couple things. I think there is a gift in COVID, and it's a very difficult thing to say when so many people are suffering, so many people have died, and the effects of COVID are going to last for a long time. I mean, this is a painful time in human history. With that said, it is an opportunity for us to look at the world through a different lens and to do things differently. Diversity is one thing that I think will actually benefit from the world we're in right now, because we can actually go out and reach out to talent, to the innovators in the most remotest parts of the world, where before they may not have been able or willing to come to the CBD of one city or the next, we now know that we can work remotely with some people quite effectively. So I see the diversity of workforce being a positive outcome on what was really forced upon us.
You mentioned before the word change, and this is obviously a change that has been induced by a pandemic that people have no choice but to participate in. What happens as things go back to normal and people suddenly find themselves in a position where, they have to confront this change as part of the new normal? How does a company adapt and prepare its team for that change?
Yeah, listen, I really don't like the word normal. My career has been built on actually disrupting normal. And what I mean by that is status quo is normal, right? It's the way we do things, the way we've always done things. It is normal. It's the norm. If you turn that upside down and always look to doing something differently, to changing, then you're innovating. And that's really what's important to us here at YBF, is it's about looking at technology, looking at change, looking at crises, looking at opportunity, all as ways to drive value, to do things differently, to turn tech, if you will, from a disruptor into an enabler. And that's what companies need. That's what people need. That's what people want.
Could you give us some examples of how YBF is working with Honeywell to drive that innovation?
Yeah, we're doing a lot of really interesting things together. So Honeywell is an innovative company in its own right. And I would think that Honeywell will acknowledge this as well, that a lot of that innovation has happened within the walls of Honeywell. And what we've been able to do together actually is take that innovation that's so Honeywell and figure out how do we take tentacles into a broader, more diverse group of companies, of founders, of individuals, so that not only can innovation happen within the walls of Honeywell, but innovation that's happening outside of Honeywell can influence, connect, do things differently. YBF's ability, its ecosystem, is all about helping startups to scale up to succeed, and corporates to innovate. And we do that by bringing these what are apparently disparate groups of people, of companies, of disruptors, of enablers together to think, act, and do things in a manner that is not the status quo.
And how does YBF facilitate that connection between smaller companies who work with a certain cadence with a Honeywell who, has a cadence that's on a completely different spectrum?
Yeah, the way I describe how we get small companies and medium companies to work with large companies is I use an analogy around cogs and gearing. So if you think about a big company as a cog moving very slowly, right? And you think about disruptors or enablers or smaller companies as a small cog moving very, very quickly, okay? A spinning cog. If you put those two together, what happens? You got a big cog moving slowly and another one spinning. A lot of teeth go flying, and usually that cog, that's that small company, becomes a circle. All the teeth have been spit out, and therefore there's no traction. There's no change to the big cog. So YBF, in essence, creates all those intermediary cogs, if you will, that enables the small cog to interface with the big cog and to make a difference. Whether it's around culture, whether it's around how do you work together, whether it's around adjusting how people communicate, how people think, what processes make sense and what processes don't make sense. It's all those things that enable an ecosystem and those cogs to work well together to create ultimately a trajectory change in the big cog, a speed change in the big cog, and maybe in some cases even a complete direction shift.
And what do you think makes YBF so successful in being that intermediary cog? What is the secret sauce behind a partnership like that?
Yeah, listen, I'm a big believer in diversity. It's something that has been a fundamental part of my career and something that I've driven no matter where I've been. And I think diversity is part of the key. So we come from a background a wide background of people. So I have a big company background, but I also have a creative background. We have other individuals on the team that are from big companies. We have founders. We have people out of university. We have people that have lived rurally. We have people that have lived in big cities. We are a small team. We're 55% female. We speak 8 languages. We come from 5 different countries. It's that diversity that allows us to be ambidextrous, to speak different languages, to kind of think through problems in a different way and connect all the dots.
What about more traditional companies in more traditional industries, such as law or finance or accounting? How do they adapt to the new normal when they haven't had that innovation in their DNA for a long time?
Listen, it's got to start with people. Okay, I don't think companies exist, obviously, without people. So if a company is led by folks that don't want to innovate and has a staff or an employee base that doesn't want to innovate, innovation is going to be very difficult to, number one, kick off or be part of the culture, and number 2, sustain. Okay, so you can talk about industries, maybe legal, that are more traditional, but they're only as traditional as the leaders that make up the company. And leadership comes at all levels. So I would, Lander and Rogers is a great example. They're our innovative hub partner for legal tech, led by a team that looks at their industry as something that will change, and they can either be part of the change and drive the change, or they can become part of history and not a good part of history. So again, this really goes towards the need to innovate and towards the need to lead. My big belief is that as a leader, you need to take personal risks in order to drive things forward. And companies that don't have leaders, again, at all levels, willing to take a personal risk on behalf of the shareholder, on behalf of the customers they serve, on behalf of the employees that count on them, they're not going to innovate. They're not going to change, and they're not going to make the difference.
Yeah, and the impacts of innovation are so long to realize for some companies, whether it's for the shareholders, for their customers, or for the employees. How does a successful innovation look like within a company? How do you define successful innovation?
Probably history is the best, determiner of whether innovation was successful or not. I'd go back to my comment about restlessness. I think if you are innovating and changing, it's going to feel a bit uncomfortable. It's not going to feel like you're on steady ground all the time. If everything feels really simple, really easy, you're probably not innovating. And I've used this analogy before, but growing up in the northeast of the U.S. as a ski racer, if you're not falling down, then you're probably not taking the toughest slope, the toughest course. You're probably not pushing yourself. So it takes failures. It takes falling down. It takes getting back up and brushing yourself off and realizing that, there was no harm done. And actually, you've just learned something which is going to enable something different to happen later.
In light of COVID-19, a lot of companies are now facing fundamental questions about the sustainability of the current business models. And that goes to the need to innovate. But there is that tension between, do I focus on business as usual right now, or do I focus on innovating within my company? How does that company strike that balance?
Every industry and every company is really different, Jason. And it really comes down to what and who the company is serving, what products and services they are producing and providing, and figuring out when to look internally and when to look externally. It's really seldom black or white, and it's seldom either one or two. It's typically both. I think of strategy and operations as two sides of the same coin, and you kind of need to spin it. So you need to strategize and operationalize at the same time, and you need to be flexible in both. If you spend a year thinking about a strategy and then 3 years executing, you're probably going to fail.
And you mentioned internal versus external innovation. Could you give us a rundown of what the differences are?
Yeah, again, I think it really does depend on the company. So to me, it's finding the right balance. You should build an internal innovation capability, an internal innovation mindset. And you should reward your team not only for keeping the lights on, but for innovating. But you should also acknowledge that there are subject matter experts, there are places to go, there are ecosystems and individuals that might not be part of the internal core that need to be accessed. I mean, that's really the power of YBF.
Farley, this morning I was reading the AFR, and in the news, one of the federal ministers had said that innovation is going to be the new vocabulary for the next couple of years because of COVID-19. What responsibility do these large companies have in light of the huge societal and economic disruptions to society? How do they give back to society? How do they interact with society post COVID-19?
I think we all have to figure this out. So whether it be at the micro level of you and I as individuals, figuring out how do we help make the world a better place. I mean, however grandiose that seems, we can make it real and personal by saying, how do we make it safe and secure for our partners, for our children, for our families? That is innovation. There's a role that government needs to play. There's a role big companies need to play, and there's absolutely a role for startups and scale-ups. I think bringing that ecosystem together of people thinking and acting differently, leveraging the diversity of mindset, of thought, of experience, of location, to think about the world differently. So, we're sitting here in the Melbourne CBD today. It's much quieter than normal, obviously, and part of the challenge we have here is how do we look at public transportation differently in a world where folks need to be socially distanced? How do we, at the same time, not lose the focus and all the benefits of mass transportation and the environment, but at the same time figure out how do we get people coming into work maybe a bit separate. So we certainly don't want to set the clock back and everybody drive in. That doesn't really help in any manner. I don't have a lot of the answers. There's a lot smarter people than me out there, but ultimately we all need to kind of think through this together. So it's going to question a lot of the things that we thought we were doing right. Okay, and I think we have done a lot of things right. Transportation and free tram zones like they have here in Melbourne, but you can't do that in the same manner anymore. So getting through this puzzle, this obstacle course, will actually make us strong on the other side. It's going to be difficult, it's going to be challenging, but that's what drives innovation. And I think technology will have a role, but technology for technology's sake is not the answer. It starts with leadership, it starts with diversity, it starts with a mindset, it starts really with a culture of being open to change, of doing things differently, and it's really, really important.
You mentioned the word ecosystem a couple of times, and a lot of people might not be familiar with the concept of a startup ecosystem. How do you define ecosystem?
Yeah, I don't love the word ecosystem. I think it's actually really overused in the startup world. But I can't think of a better word. And what an ecosystem does is really a whole group of parts, if you will, of people and founders and companies and processes and policies that come together to almost form a living organism. Okay, and what YBF does is continuously expand that ecosystem, that living organism, to include as much diverse mindset, thought, disruption, enablement as possible in order to drive innovation, in order to create jobs, in order to do things differently. And that's really what ecosystem means to us.
And what defines a successful ecosystem versus a not so successful ecosystem?
I'm not sure is the short answer. I guess what I would say is that, to make an ecosystem successful, it needs to be actively managed just like anything else. To passively have a meeting and expect magic to come doesn't really work. You need to curate it. You need to bring people together. You need to have the conversation in the open. You need to have a level of transparency that can be painful at times. I'm a big believer that you need to sometimes have a bust, if you will, in order to have a breakthrough. And, an ecosystem, a healthy ecosystem, is one that allows healthy tension and healthy conversations and very different and maybe very difficult conversations to happen. I think that's exactly why we do what we do. And what we do with innovation hubs is to create, it's not really the tension side of things, but it is to create the meeting and curation of parts that might not meet in the natural world together. And that's what an ecosystem means to me.
And how do you think this ecosystem will evolve with COVID-19? Because, a lot of what happened at YBF prior to COVID-19 was people meeting, in public spaces, meeting together, having, in-person chats. How will COVID-19 change all of that?
I think the good thing is that technology's been around forever, and as a technology and innovation hub, we've been leveraging Zoom and other things for a long time. We've virtualized a number of our meetings and content, but we've been doing that previously. I still believe, though, that we're not going to go from a world where everybody's together to a world where everybody's apart. Those are two sides, two very far apart ends of a continuum. And the answer is somewhere in the middle. So where we might have been in a world where everybody worked in the office, and that was, we'll call it 90%. I'm just making that up at this point. But we're not going to go from 90% to zero. Okay, we're probably going to go from 90% in the office down to 70% in the office. And that's a big enough shift. It's going to change the way companies and countries and cities look. But ultimately, it's when you bring people together and when you have real conversations. I mean, we could have had this, we're actually having this as going to be a virtual fireside chat or a virtual talk rather than one in front of a live studio audience, so to speak. But I think it's much more powerful for me to sit right next to you, Jason, and for us to, we're 1.5 meters apart, but to sit close enough for us to look at each other and to leverage each other and to bounce ideas back at each other. You don't get that same thing on a call. You can get close, but at the end of the day, it's really important that we are social animals, that we leverage that, but we just leverage it wisely and differently, and we get a bit picky how we use it. So, we're not 90 or 100% in the office anymore, but we're probably still 70%.
You mentioned boom or bust as part of a critical part of innovation. How does a leader prepare the team to embrace and confront failure? Because that's not something that comes naturally to a lot of people.
Yeah. I use the word balance a lot as well, but I do think you need to find the right balance. I think you can be tough but fair. I think you can hold people accountable for doing their jobs, but also let them fail in their roles. I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. So you can have very clear performance requirements of the role, but at the same time, know what things are really important that are, have to happen around values, around safety, around customer, and what things are worth trips along the way. I think it's that balance.
Farley, for a lot of people, they've never been through a pandemic before, and a lot of leaders have never faced such a crisis in their lifetime. How should leaders behave throughout a crisis like COVID-19?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, most people obviously haven't been through a crisis like this because there hasn't been a crisis like this, right? Some companies, and I've been at a couple that have gone through a number of crises. Part of it is understanding what's going on, understanding what people are feeling, and how they're doing. But it's really being the best part of yourself. And I think it also comes down to, some leaders are good at crises and some are not. But crises happen. And I would argue that actually, hopefully never to this extent again, but companies need to create this burning platform, this need for change, and good leaders do that. Good leaders don't pretend that things are just moving along, because the world does change. The environment changes. The thermostat for a coal-fired plant of the 1800s, at some point needed to evolve. And if everybody just kind of did that, if the Model T was the first and the last car that was produced, we probably would be looking at something else. So I would say that leaders need to feel comfortable with change. They need to embrace it. And they need to understand what staff and customers need. And that is to help remove the uncertainty. And I think you do that by being transparent. And even if that transparency is to admit that the future is not certain, there is some comfort in that. There is some comfort in knowing that we are all in this together, and that everybody has a role and a part to get through.
And how do you strike a balance between being too transparent versus being transparent enough?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask that. So I'd say if I have a flaw, it's being too transparent. But you know what? I'm not going to change that. I think that transparency has enabled me to create teams that really get it, that really embrace change, that embrace doing things differently. And that's what's really exciting when you have a team that is okay living in an ambiguous world, is okay moving forward, helps each other. And I think transparency is absolutely key to that.
Farley, we're going to go to some rapid fire one-word questions. So if you could just maybe give your take on what that one word is, and maybe elaborate a bit about that one word.
So one word, but more words.
Yeah, one word, then more words. So if you had one word for innovation in the new normal, what would that be?
Culture. And what I mean by that is creating a culture that thrives in change, thrives in disruption, thrives in ambiguity. You need it. It has to be there. And if it's not there, then you'll be a footnote in history.
One word for business in the new normal.
Challenging. And I think it will be challenging. We're going to see a lot of changes, and some of them are going to be very, very uncomfortable. And it's going to be very, very personal for a lot of people. And that's, I think, the biggest heartbreak in all this. But we can all do our part to help. Big companies, small companies, founders, individuals. We can create an economy that flourishes, but it's going to be hard.
One word for leadership in the new normal.
Risks. And to me, that's about taking the personal risk on behalf of shareholders, on behalf of employees, on behalf of the customers you serve and the environments that you play within.
Technology in the new normal.
Enabler. Technology is both a disruptor and an enabler. To me, they're actually the same word. Okay, by doing things differently, by doing things faster, by enabling people to spend time on other things and think through problems in a different way, technology is going to get us through.
What about society in the new normal?
One word I would have is more of a descriptor, which is I'm hopeful. We're in a world that's in a lot of pain right now, and I'm hopeful that society will be better for it. I said earlier today that sometimes you need a breakdown to get a breakthrough. I hope what we're seeing out of the US and other parts of the world right now is the bust, is the breakdown that's needed to get us well beyond it and put in our rearview mirror once and for all.